Marcus Kane stood at the edge of his property line, breathing in the crisp mountain air that still carried the scent of pine and snow from the peaks above. His weathered hands gripped the deed to the land, a document that represented more than just ownership to him. It represented freedom from the nightmares that had plagued him for 3 years since returning from his final deployment in Afghanistan. The mountain sprawled before him like a sleeping giant, covered in dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. 2,000 acres of untouched wilderness, complete with streams that ran crystal clear and wildlife that had known little human interference. For a man who had spent too many years looking through a rifle scope at targets that were once human beings, this place felt like salvation. Marcus had purchased the land with his military savings and the settlement money from his medical discharge. The doctors called it PTSD, but to Marcus, it was simply the weight of too many lives taken in the name of duty. Every night, he would wake in cold sweats, hearing the echo of his rifle and seeing the faces of men who had fallen to his precision shooting. The military had trained him to be the perfect weapon, but no one had prepared him for the cost of carrying that burden home. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was 40 miles down a winding mountain road that tested even the most experienced drivers. The isolation was exactly what Marcus needed. No crowds, no sudden noises that would send his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. No well-meaning civilians thanking him for his service while having no idea what that service had actually entailed. His cabin was modest, but functional, built with his own hands over the course of 6 months. Every nail he hammered and every board he placed was therapeutic, a way of creating something instead of destroying it. The structure sat in a natural clearing overlooking a valley where deer would come to graze in the early morning hours. Marcus had positioned it strategically, with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple exit routes, old habits from his military training that he could not shake. The first year had been the hardest. The silence of the mountains was deafening to a man accustomed to the constant noise of military bases and combat zones. He found himself jumping at the snap of twigs under the feet of wandering elk or the call of hawks circling overhead. Gradually, though, the peace began to work its way into his soul. The nightmares became less frequent, and he started to sleep through the night without reaching for a weapon. Marcus established routines that gave structure to his days. He would rise before dawn and walk the perimeter of his property, a habit that served both as exercise and security patrol. The mountain was home to black bears, mountain lions, and occasional wolves, but Marcus felt more kinship with these predators than he did with most humans. They killed to survive, not because orders demanded it. During these morning walks, he began to notice signs of the delicate ecosystem that thrived on his mountain. Families of deer that had established regular migration patterns, a pair of eagles that nested in the tall pines near the northern ridge, and countless smaller creatures that called this place home. For the first time since his childhood, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that did not involve violence. He started keeping detailed journals of the wildlife patterns, noting which animals used which trails and during what seasons. The exercise reminded him of the reconnaissance work he had done during his military service, but this time the intelligence he gathered was used to protect rather than eliminate. He installed motion-activated cameras at strategic points around the property, partly for security, but mostly to document the natural life cycles occurring around him. The transformation was gradual, but profound. Marcus began to see himself not as a retired killer trying to forget his past, but as a guardian of something precious and vulnerable. The mountain had given him peace, and he felt an obligation to protect it in return. He researched wildlife conservation, studied the local ecosystem, and even reached out to park rangers in the area to better understand the challenges facing the region's animal populations. It was during one of these conversations with a park ranger named Sarah Williams that Marcus first learned about the poaching problem in the surrounding area. Sarah was a veteran ranger with 20 years of experience, and she had grown increasingly frustrated with the sophisticated poaching operations that were decimating wildlife populations across the region. These were not subsistence hunters taking a deer to feed their families, but organized criminals targeting rare species for profit. The poachers were particularly interested in black bears, which they would kill for their gallbladders and paws, both considered valuable in certain traditional medicine markets. Mountain lions were targeted for their pelts and bones, while even elk and deer were being taken in numbers far exceeding what the ecosystem could sustain. The profit margins were enormous, and the penalties for getting caught were relatively light, making it an attractive criminal enterprise. Sarah explained that the poachers had become increasingly bold and sophisticated in their operations. They used night vision equipment, silent vehicles, and coordinated hunting parties that could strip an area of its wildlife in a matter of hours. The vast wilderness areas made it nearly impossible for the undermanned Park Service to patrol effectively, and by the time rangers discovered evidence of poaching, the criminals had long since disappeared. Marcus listened to these stories with growing anger. He had not survived 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan just to watch criminals destroy the sanctuary he had found in these mountains. The protective instincts that had kept his unit alive in combat began to stir again, but this time they were focused on defending something he truly cared about rather than following orders he sometimes questioned. He began to pay closer attention to his security cameras, looking for any signs of human intrusion on his property. The cameras had originally been installed to monitor wildlife, but Marcus quickly realized they could serve a dual purpose. He upgraded the system, adding more cameras with better night vision capabilities and installing them at every possible access point to his land. For several months, the cameras showed nothing but the usual parade of wildlife. Marcus began to think that perhaps the poaching problem had not reached his remote corner of the mountains. Then, on a cold October morning, he discovered tracks near his eastern boundary that made his blood run cold. Boot prints in the soft earth, accompanied by tire marks from an ATV, leading deeper into his property. The tracks were 2 days old, but Marcus could read them like a book. 3 men, moving in a tactical formation that suggested military or law enforcement training. They had approached his land from a logging road that had been abandoned for over a decade, indicating they knew the area well. Most telling were the drag marks leading back toward the road, suggesting they had killed something and hauled it away. Marcus followed the trail deeper into his property, his old military instincts taking over. He moved silently through the underbrush, reading signs like words on a page. The men had set up a temporary camp in a grove of aspens about 2 miles from his cabin, complete with a fire pit and evidence that they had butchered an animal on site. Bloodstains on the rocks told the story of a large kill, most likely one of the elk that Marcus had been tracking for months. The rage that filled Marcus was different from anything he had experienced in combat. In Afghanistan, anger had been a luxury he could not afford, something that would compromise his effectiveness and endanger his team. Here, on his own land, protecting creatures he had come to care about, the anger felt righteous and pure. He spent the rest of the day documenting the evidence, taking photographs and GPS coordinates of everything he found. The poachers had been careless, leaving behind shell casings, food wrappers, and even a cigarette, but that might contain DNA. Marcus collected it all, his training in evidence preservation serving him well in this new context. That evening, he called Sarah Williams to report the intrusion. She listened with obvious frustration as Marcus described what he had found, explaining that while she could file a report, the chances of catching the perpetrators were slim. The poachers were clearly professionals who knew how to cover their tracks, and by the time any official investigation could be mounted, they would be long gone. After ending the call, Marcus sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the peaks, his mind working through possibilities. The law might be helpless against these criminals, but Marcus Kane was not helpless. He had skills that had been honed in the world's most dangerous places, and he had a motivation stronger than any military order he had ever received. The mountain had saved his life, giving him peace when he thought peace was impossible. Now it was time for him to return the favor. The poachers had made a critical error by trespassing on his land. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who had spent years learning to hunt the most dangerous prey of all, and who would do anything to protect the sanctuary that had given his life meaning again. As darkness fell over the mountain, Marcus began to plan. The next time the poachers came to his land, they would find more than they bargained for. They would find a man who understood that some things were worth fighting for, and who had the skills to make that fight count. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountain in a thick layer of snow that muffled sounds and made tracking both easier and more dangerous. Marcus had spent the weeks since discovering the poaching evidence preparing his property like a battlefield commander planning a defense. Every trail was mapped, every blind spot identified, and every possible approach monitored by his expanding network of surveillance equipment. The motion-activated cameras had revealed disturbing patterns. The poachers were not random trespassers, but part of an organized operation that had been systematically working the area for months. Different teams would hit different sections of the wilderness, staying ahead of any law enforcement response. Marcus's property, with its abundant wildlife and remote location, was apparently next on their list. Through careful analysis of the camera footage from neighboring areas, Marcus had identified at least 3 separate poaching teams operating in the region. Each team consisted of 3 to 4 men with military-grade equipment and vehicles modified for silent operation. They communicated using encrypted radio systems and employed sophisticated hunting techniques that suggested professional training. The first team had been the one that initially trespassed on his land, taking the elk that Marcus had been monitoring for months. The second team operated primarily at night, targeting black bears and mountain lions with thermal imaging equipment. The third team was the most concerning, consisting of men who moved with the precision of Special Operations Forces and seemed to be coordinating the overall operation. Marcus had reached out to other property owners in the area, only to discover that many had experienced similar problems but felt powerless to stop them. An elderly rancher named Bill Morrison had lost 3 prize elk from his private hunting reserve, despite having invested thousands of dollars in security fencing. A wildlife photographer named Elena Vasquez had documented the systematic elimination of a wolf pack she had been studying for 2 years. The common thread in all these stories was the complete failure of official law enforcement to make any meaningful impact on the problem. The poachers were too well-organized, too mobile, and too familiar with the terrain for traditional police work to be effective. They struck quickly and disappeared into the vast wilderness before anyone could respond. Sarah Williams had confided to Marcus that the Park Service was facing budget cuts that made the situation even worse. They had lost 3 ranger positions in the past year and were operating with equipment that was often decades old. The poachers, meanwhile, seemed to have unlimited resources and the latest technology. It was an unfair fight that the good guys were losing badly. Marcus spent his days hiking every inch of his property, memorizing terrain features, and identifying strategic positions. His military training had taught him that knowledge of the battlefield was the most important factor in any engagement, and he approached this preparation with the same intensity he had once brought to combat missions. He established concealed observation posts at key locations, each equipped with supplies for extended surveillance and communication equipment to coordinate with his cabin. The positions were camouflaged so well that even experienced outdoorsmen would walk past them without notice. Marcus had learned these skills during long-range reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan, where detection meant death. The cabin itself became a command center, with detailed maps covering every wall and a sophisticated monitoring system that could track movement across his entire property in real time. Marcus had invested his life savings in upgrading the surveillance network, but he considered it money well spent if it helped protect the wildlife that had become his responsibility. During one of his evening patrols in late November, Marcus discovered fresh signs that the poachers were planning another incursion. Tire tracks on the abandoned logging road indicated that someone had been scouting the area, probably looking for the best approach to his land. The tracks were from large vehicles capable of hauling significant cargo, suggesting they were planning a major operation. Marcus increased his surveillance activities, spending 18 hours a day monitoring his cameras and patrolling his perimeter. The winter weather made the work brutal, with temperatures dropping below 0 and snow falling almost daily. But Marcus had endured worse conditions during his military service, and the knowledge that he was protecting something precious kept him motivated. On December 15th, his patience was rewarded. The motion sensors detected movement on the eastern approach to his property at 3:17 a.m. Marcus was instantly awake, his military training having programmed him to respond to alerts even from deep sleep. He quickly accessed his monitoring system and confirmed that 3 vehicles were approaching through the forest, their headlights off and engines running quietly. The vehicles moved in a tactical formation that immediately told Marcus he was dealing with professionals. They maintained proper intervals to avoid being disabled by a single explosive device, communicated using hand signals visible through his night vision cameras, and approached his property from the direction that offered the best concealment. Marcus watched from his command center as 12 men deployed from the vehicles and began moving toward his land with military precision. They were heavily armed with high-powered rifles and thermal imaging equipment, dressed in camouflage that was appropriate for the local terrain. These are not amateur poachers, but soldiers engaged in an illegal war against wildlife. The leader of the group was a tall man with the bearing of a career military officer. He moved with confidence and authority, directing his men with hand signals that Marcus recognized from his own training. The other men responded with the instant obedience that came from rigorous discipline and extensive practice working together. Marcus felt a familiar calm settle over him as he prepared to engage the enemy. This was what he had been trained for, what he was good at, what had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. The only difference was that this time he was fighting for something he chose to protect rather than following orders from politicians who had never faced enemy fire. He activated his secure communication system and considered calling for backup, but quickly realized that no help would arrive in time to matter. The nearest law enforcement was hours away, and by the time they could respond, the poachers would have completed their mission and disappeared. This was a fight Marcus would have to win on his own. The poachers split into 3 teams of 4 men each, covering more ground and making it harder for any single defender to track all of them. It was a sound tactical decision that showed they understood the challenges of operating in unfamiliar territory. Unfortunately for them, this territory was far from unfamiliar to Marcus. He had walked every square foot of his property countless times, in all weather conditions and at all times of day and night. He knew where the ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps, where the wind patterns would carry sounds, and where the natural features of the land would force intruders to move in predictable patterns. Marcus quickly formulated a plan that would allow him to engage the poachers without putting himself at unnecessary risk. He would not try to fight all 12 men simultaneously, but would instead use the terrain and his superior knowledge of the area to engage them piecemeal, turning their numerical advantage against them. The first team was moving toward a meadow where a family of deer often grazed in the early morning hours. Marcus had installed several cameras in that area specifically to monitor the deer, and he knew the poachers would have to cross a narrow ravine to reach the meadow. The ravine was the perfect place for an ambush. Moving through the forest with the silent efficiency that had made him one of the military's most effective snipers, Marcus positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the ravine. His rifle was a custom-built weapon that combined the accuracy he needed with the reliability required for mountain conditions. He had spent countless hours zeroing the scope and practicing with ammunition specifically chosen for long-range accuracy. Through his scope, Marcus watched the first team of poachers approach the ravine. They moved cautiously but confidently, clearly believing that they were operating in undefended territory. The team leader kept checking a GPS device, probably following coordinates provided by whoever was coordinating their operation. As the team entered the ravine, Marcus had a clear shot at all 4 men. In Afghanistan, he would have engaged immediately, taking out as many targets as possible before they could respond. But this was not Afghanistan, and these men, despite being criminals, were still American citizens operating on American soil. Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable during his military service. Instead of shooting to kill, he would give them a chance to surrender. It was a choice that went against his training and his tactical instincts, but it felt right for the man he was trying to become. He activated a loudspeaker system he had installed for exactly this purpose, and spoke in the command voice that had once directed Marines in combat. "This is the property owner. You are trespassing on private land. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The reaction was immediate and violent. The poachers opened fire in his direction, their muzzle flashes lighting up the ravine like deadly fireworks. Bullets snapped through the air around Marcus's position, some coming close enough that he could feel their passage. Any doubt about their intentions was immediately erased. Marcus dropped behind cover as the hillside erupted in gunfire. The poachers were using automatic weapons, filling the air with a deadly hail of bullets that shredded trees and sent rocks flying. They were clearly prepared for armed resistance and had no intention of surrendering peacefully. The brief firefight ended as suddenly as it had begun when the poachers realized they were shooting at shadows. Marcus had already moved from his original position, using escape routes he had prepared months earlier. The poachers regrouped quickly, their leader issuing orders in a voice that carried clearly through the cold mountain air. "Contact to the north. Single shooter, probably the landowner. Team 2, flank left. Team 3, establish overwatch. We finish this quickly and get what we came for." Marcus smiled grimly as he listened to the orders. The poachers were treating this as a military operation, which meant they would follow predictable tactical patterns. But they were operating on his ground by his rules, and he had advantages they could not imagine. The war for his mountain had begun, and Marcus Kane intended to win it. The mountain became a chessboard where Marcus held every advantage except numbers. While the poachers had superior firepower and military training, they were operating in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who knew every rock, every tree, and every sound the forest made when disturbed. Marcus had spent 2 years learning the mountain's secrets, and now those secrets would become weapons. From a secondary position, Marcus watched through night vision as the poachers attempted to execute their flanking maneuver. Team 2 was moving through a dense stand of pine trees that Marcus knew contained a natural choke point where fallen logs forced anyone traveling through to follow a specific path. It was exactly where he wanted them. Marcus had spent weeks preparing this area, not with explosive devices that would harm the environment he was trying to protect, but with simpler solutions that would be just as effective. A carefully positioned tripwire connected to a counterweight system would drop a heavy log across their path, trapping them in the choke point long enough for him to act. The lead poacher triggered the mechanism exactly as Marcus had planned. The massive log crashed down with a thunderous noise that echoed through the forest, blocking their retreat route and causing them to dive for cover. In the confusion that followed, Marcus had a clear shot at their communication equipment. His first shot destroyed the radio antenna on the team leader's backpack, cutting off their ability to coordinate with the other teams. His second shot punctured the battery pack on their thermal imaging device, sending sparks flying and eliminating their night vision advantage. Marcus was not trying to kill these men, but he was systematically destroying their ability to operate effectively. The poachers responded with disciplined suppressing fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes that were no longer there. Marcus had already moved to his third position, a concealed hide he had built into the natural rock formation on the ridge. From this position, he had overlapping fields of fire covering multiple approach routes. Team 3 was attempting to establish overwatch from a high point that Marcus had anticipated they would choose. It was the tactically obvious position, which made it the wrong position. Marcus had prepared a surprise for anyone who tried to use that particular piece of high ground. A carefully concealed pit, covered with branches and leaves, opened under the feet of the team's designated marksman. The man fell 8 feet into the hole, his rifle clattering on the rocks above as he crashed into the padding Marcus had placed at the bottom. The pit was not deep enough to seriously injure anyone, but it effectively removed one threat from the battlefield. The poachers' teammates rushed to help their fallen comrade, exactly as Marcus had predicted they would. Their concern for each other was admirable, but tactically foolish when facing an enemy who understood how to exploit such weaknesses. While 3 men struggled to extract their teammate from the pit, Marcus moved to engage the third team. Team 1 had regrouped from their encounter in the ravine and was advancing toward Marcus's cabin, probably intending to eliminate what they perceived as the command center of his defensive operation. They moved with the confidence of men who had faced armed resistance before and emerged victorious. What they did not realize was that the cabin was not Marcus's actual command post, but a carefully prepared trap. Every window had been equipped with motion sensors that would trigger bright floodlights when approached, temporarily blinding anyone using night vision equipment. The porch had been rigged with speakers that would broadcast pre-recorded sound designed to confuse and disorient intruders. As the team approached the cabin, their night vision devices were suddenly overwhelmed by intense light. The speakers erupted with the sounds of multiple firearms being charged and ready positions being assumed. To men expecting to face a single defender, the audio suggested they were walking into an ambush by a much larger force. The team leader made the tactically sound decision to withdraw and reassess the situation. But Marcus had anticipated this response as well, and their withdrawal route led them directly into another prepared position. A network of thin wires strung between trees at ankle height would not seriously harm anyone, but would create noise and confusion in the darkness. The sounds of men stumbling and cursing carried clearly through the cold mountain air, giving Marcus perfect intelligence on their location and movement. He moved through the forest like a ghost, using every piece of cover and concealment the terrain offered. Years of combat experience had taught him how to become invisible even when enemies knew he was nearby. From his mobile position, Marcus could see that the poachers were regrouping near their vehicles. Their leader was clearly frustrated with the resistance they had encountered, speaking into a radio that Marcus realized must be connected to a larger network. These men were not operating independently, but were part of a much larger criminal organization. The radio conversation was brief, but revealing. The team leader was reporting to someone identified only as Control that they had encountered organized resistance and requesting permission to escalate response. The answer came back immediately. Neutralize opposition. Complete mission. Time critical. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The poachers had just received authorization to kill him, and their casual discussion of murder suggested this was not their first such operation. He was dealing with men who were willing to commit any crime necessary to protect their illegal enterprise. The nature of the conflict suddenly escalated from property defense to a fight for survival. Marcus was no longer dealing with criminals who might be deterred by resistance, but with killers who had been ordered to eliminate him. The rules of engagement had just changed dramatically. As if to confirm his assessment, one of the poachers produced what appeared to be a grenade launcher from their vehicle. These men had come prepared for war, not simple poaching. Marcus realized he was facing a professional military unit that happened to be engaged in wildlife crime rather than conventional warfare. The first grenade exploded near his cabin, sending flames and debris flying through the air. The structure that Marcus had built with his own hands, his sanctuary and refuge, was being systematically destroyed by men who saw it as nothing more than a tactical obstacle. The attack on his home felt like an assault on his very identity. Marcus felt the familiar cold rage that had once made him one of the military's most effective operators. But this time the anger was pure and righteous, uncontaminated by questions about political objectives or military necessity. He was defending his home, his land, and the wildlife that had become his responsibility. The second grenade landed closer to his current position, showering him with dirt and rocks, but confirming that the poachers did not know his exact location. They were using area weapons to flush him out, a tactic that might work in open country, but was less effective in dense forest where natural cover was abundant. Marcus decided it was time to go on the offensive. He had been fighting a defensive action designed to deter the poachers and protect the wildlife, but their escalation to lethal weapons meant he could no longer afford to show restraint. These men had declared war on him and everything he cared about. His first target was the man with the grenade launcher, who had positioned himself behind one of their vehicles for cover. Marcus had a clear shot from his current position, and his military training had prepared him for exactly this type of engagement. The difference was that this time, he was shooting to protect rather than to conquer. The shot was perfect, taking out the grenade launcher, and the man holding it with a single round that demonstrated why Marcus had once been considered one of the military's elite snipers. The weapon exploded in the man's hands, sending his teammates diving for cover and eliminating their most dangerous capability. The remaining poachers responded with everything they had, filling the forest with automatic weapons fire that shredded trees and sent wildlife fleeing in terror. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the thought of the animals he had been protecting being traumatized by this violence. But he channeled that anger into cold, tactical precision. Moving from position to position with the fluid grace of a predator, Marcus began systematically eliminating the poaching team. Each shot was carefully placed to neutralize a threat while conserving ammunition. These were not the spray and pray tactics of panicked amateurs, but the precise, economical violence of a professional warrior. The poacher's numerical advantage was meaningless in terrain that favored the defender. Marcus could move unseen through forest he knew intimately, while they stumbled through unfamiliar ground that offered concealment to their enemy and exposure to themselves. One by one, the poachers fell to Marcus's superior marksmanship and tactical positioning. Some tried to retreat to their vehicles, only to discover that Marcus had anticipated this move and disabled their transportation. Others attempted to surrender, but Marcus could no longer trust that their surrenders were genuine after they had been ordered to kill him. As dawn broke over the mountain, Marcus stood alone among the bodies of 12 men who had come to his land intending to steal from the wildlife and murder anyone who tried to stop them. The silence of the forest seemed deeper than usual, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of violence. Marcus felt no satisfaction in the killing, only a grim certainty that he had done what was necessary to protect something precious and irreplaceable. The poachers had chosen their fate when they brought military weapons to a mountain that wanted only to be left in peace. But as he surveyed the battlefield that his sanctuary had become, Marcus realized that this was only the beginning. The radio conversation he had overheard suggested that these men were part of a much larger organization, and their failure to report back would eventually bring more hunters to his mountain. The war was far from over. The cleanup took Marcus 3 days of careful, methodical work that tested every skill he had learned in military forensics and battlefield recovery operations. 12 bodies had to be processed, vehicles had to be searched for intelligence, and evidence had to be preserved while maintaining operational security. Marcus approached the task with the same professional detachment he had once brought to similar work in war zones. Each poacher carried identification that revealed a disturbing pattern. They were all military veterans with extensive combat experience, discharged from various elite units over the past 5 years. Their service records, found in encrypted files on tablet computers, showed deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and several classified operations in Africa and South America. These were not ordinary criminals, but displaced warriors who had found a way to monetize their deadly skills. The vehicles contained sophisticated communication equipment, military-grade weapons, and detailed intelligence files on wildlife patterns throughout the region. Maps marked with GPS coordinates showed the locations of rare species, migration routes, and the estimated value of various animals in illegal markets. This was not opportunistic poaching, but a carefully planned military operation against endangered wildlife. Most disturbing were the personnel files Marcus discovered in the lead vehicle's secured storage compartment. Detailed dossiers on park rangers, wildlife photographers, and private landowners who had interfered with poaching operations. Sarah Williams' file was 3 pages long, including photographs of her home and family, suggesting she had been marked for elimination. Marcus found his own file, compiled from public records, and surveillance photos taken without his knowledge. The file identified him as a high-value target, whose military background made him particularly dangerous to their operations. There were detailed floor plans of his cabin, analysis of his defensive preparations, and tactical assessments of the best approaches to neutralize him. The discovery that he had been under surveillance for months without knowing it was professionally embarrassing, but the threat to Sarah and others who were simply trying to protect wildlife filled Marcus with cold fury. These men had planned to murder anyone who stood between them and their profits, treating conservation efforts as enemy action to be eliminated with military force. Marcus spent hours examining the communication logs, piecing together the structure of the criminal organization. The poaching teams reported to a central command that coordinated operations across multiple states, using military logistics and planning to maximize profits while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. The operation was generating millions of dollars annually through the systematic slaughter of protected species. The radio equipment revealed that the organization was expecting regular reports from the team Marcus had eliminated. When those reports stopped coming, it would trigger an escalation protocol that would bring more dangerous operators to investigate. Marcus had perhaps 48 hours before the next wave of killers arrived on his mountain. He could have contacted law enforcement at this point, turning over the evidence and letting others handle the threat. The files contained enough information to shut down the entire criminal network and send dozens of people to prison for decades. But Marcus knew that the legal system would take months or years to process the evidence, during which time the organization would adapt and continue their operations elsewhere. More importantly, Marcus had seen enough government failures in his military career to know that bureaucracy often protected criminals better than it protected victims. The men who had died on his mountain would be replaced by others equally skilled and ruthless, and the cycle of violence against wildlife would continue unabated. Marcus made a decision that would have horrified his former commanding officers, but felt entirely natural to the man he had become. He would use the intelligence he had gathered to hunt down the criminal organization and eliminate it entirely. The mountain had taught him to think like a predator, and predators did not stop hunting until the threat to their territory was permanently removed. The encrypted communication logs revealed the location of the organization's main base of operations, a former military training facility in Montana that had been purchased by a shell company 2 years earlier. The facility was remote, well-defended, and staffed by dozens of former special operations personnel who had been recruited into the criminal enterprise. Marcus spent 2 weeks preparing for what would essentially be a one-man assault on a fortified position defended by professional soldiers. It was the kind of mission that would normally require a full special operations team with extensive support, but Marcus had advantages that even elite military units lacked. He was fighting for something he truly believed in rather than following orders from distant politicians. He had no rules of engagement that would limit his effectiveness or protect his enemies. Most importantly, he had nothing left to lose except the sanctuary that had saved his life, and he was willing to risk everything to protect it. The intelligence files provided detailed information about the facility's defenses, guard rotations, and the personal habits of key personnel. Marcus studied the information with the same intensity he had once brought to pre-mission briefings, looking for weaknesses and opportunities that could be exploited by a single operator with superior motivation. The facility's main weakness was its isolation. The same remoteness that protected it from law enforcement observation also meant that reinforcements could not arrive quickly if the base came under attack. Marcus could potentially eliminate the entire organization before anyone knew they were under assault. Marcus loaded his pickup truck with equipment and supplies for an extended operation. Military-grade weapons, surveillance equipment, explosives, and enough food and water for a week of independent operations. He also brought along the radio equipment he had captured from the poaching team, which would allow him to monitor the organization's communications and potentially use their own procedures against them. The drive to Montana took 14 hours through mountain roads that tested both his truck and his driving skills. Marcus used the time to mentally rehearse the operation, visualizing different scenarios and planning responses to various contingencies. By the time he reached the target area, he had developed multiple plans for infiltrating the facility and eliminating its occupants. Marcus established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the facility, using military camouflage techniques to create a hide that would be invisible even to trained observers. From this position, he could monitor the entire compound and track the movements of personnel for as long as necessary to develop a complete picture of their operations. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than the intelligence files had indicated. Multiple buildings housed different aspects of the criminal enterprise, from processing and storage facilities for stolen wildlife products to administrative centers where the business side of the operation was managed. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter on foot and in vehicles, maintaining security protocols that would not have been out of place at a military base. Marcus counted 43 personnel during his first 24 hours of surveillance, significantly more than the 25 indicated in the captured files. The organization had been growing rapidly, recruiting new personnel faster than their intelligence had been updated. This meant Marcus would be facing nearly 2 companies' worth of trained killers in a direct assault. The odds were impossible by any conventional military assessment, but Marcus was not planning a conventional military operation. He was planning to hunt these men the same way they had been hunting wildlife, by using superior knowledge, patience, and precision to eliminate them one by one until none remained a threat in his mountain. Marcus spent 3 days studying the facility's routines, identifying patterns that could be exploited and individuals whose elimination would disrupt their operations. He paid particular attention to the command structure, looking for ways to decapitate the organization's leadership and leave the remaining personnel without coordination or direction. The facility's commanding officer was a former Army colonel named Bradley Morrison who had been discharged following an investigation into war crimes during his deployment in Afghanistan. Morrison had recruited his core team from soldiers who faced similar legal problems, creating a criminal enterprise staffed by men who had already crossed the line between military service and murder for profit. Morrison's daily routine included a morning jog around the facility's perimeter, during which he was accompanied by only a single bodyguard. It was the perfect opportunity for Marcus to begin his systematic elimination of the organization's leadership, but he wanted to gather more intelligence before taking action. On his 4th night of surveillance, Marcus's patience was rewarded when he intercepted radio communications that revealed the organization's immediate plans. They were preparing to send a larger force to his mountain to investigate the disappearance of the first team and eliminate any witnesses to their operations. The new team would consist of 18 men with military vehicles and heavy weapons, tasked with sanitizing the entire area and ensuring that no evidence of their activities remained. This included killing Marcus, Sarah Williams, and several other individuals who had been identified as threats to their operations. Marcus realized that his time for preparation had run out. If he waited any longer, innocent people would die while he planned the perfect operation. It was time to begin the hunt that would determine whether his mountain remained a sanctuary or became a killing ground controlled by criminals. As he checked his equipment one final time, Marcus felt the familiar calm that had always preceded combat operations. But this time the calm was deeper and more complete than anything he had experienced during his military career. He was finally fighting for something that mattered to him personally, and the certainty of his purpose gave him strength he had never known he possessed. The war was entering its final phase, and Marcus intended to end it permanently. Marcus began his assault at 0300 hours, moving through the Montana darkness with a silent precision that had once made him a ghost in the mountains of Afghanistan. The facility's perimeter sensors were sophisticated but designed to detect conventional intrusion attempts, not a single operator who understood how such systems worked and how they could be bypassed. His first target was the communication center, a hardened building that served as the nerve center for the entire criminal operation. Eliminating their ability to coordinate and call for reinforcements would turn their numerical advantage into a liability, isolating individual teams and making them vulnerable to defeat in detail. Marcus approached the building during the guard change, when attention was focused inward on administrative procedures rather than outward on potential threats. He used explosives to destroy the main antenna array and backup power systems, then disappeared into the facility's industrial area before the guards could respond to the explosions. The loss of communications created immediate chaos throughout the facility. Guards who had been conducting routine patrols suddenly found themselves operating without coordination or clear orders. Marcus could hear the confusion in their voices as they attempted to use handheld radios to re-establish contact with their command post. Bradley Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with the authority of a man accustomed to command. He ordered his men to implement lockdown procedures and begin a systematic search for intruders, demonstrating the tactical competence that had made him successful as both a military officer and criminal leader. But Morrison was operating from outdated assumptions about the threat he faced. He had deployed his men to defend against a conventional assault by law enforcement or military forces, not against a single operator who was already inside his perimeter and operating by different rules. Marcus moved through the facility like a predator among prey, using his intimate knowledge of military procedures to anticipate his enemy's responses. When they established checkpoints, he was already past them. When they searched buildings, he was observing from positions they had not thought to secure. His second target was the motor pool, where the organization kept the vehicles they would need to evacuate or bring in reinforcements. Marcus had learned in Afghanistan that mobility was often more important than firepower, and denying enemies the ability to maneuver could be more devastating than destroying their weapons. Using thermite charges placed on engine blocks and fuel tanks, Marcus destroyed 18 vehicles in less than 10 minutes. The explosions lit up the night sky and created fires that would serve as both distraction and illumination for the next phase of his operation. The facility's fire suppression systems activated automatically, adding to the confusion and creating noise that would mask his movements. Morrison's men responded to the vehicle fires with well-drilled efficiency, but their training worked against them in this situation. They moved in formation toward the obvious threat, leaving other areas of the facility temporarily undefended. Marcus used this predictable response to access the armory, where the organization stored the military-grade weapons that made their operations so effective. The armory was a hardened bunker that would have been difficult to breach from the outside, but Marcus was already inside the facility's security perimeter. Using shaped charges placed against the bunker's ventilation system, he created an opening large enough to allow access while avoiding the heavily defended main entrance. Inside the armory, Marcus found enough weapons and ammunition to equip a small army. Military rifles, machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and explosive that had clearly been stolen from military bases or purchased through corrupt suppliers. The scale of the arsenal confirmed that the criminal organization was far larger and more dangerous than even the captured intelligence had suggested. Marcus systematically destroyed the weapons and ammunition, using the organization's own explosives to create a chain reaction that would eliminate their entire military capability. The explosion that followed was visible for miles and sent shockwaves through the facility that shattered windows and damaged structures throughout the compound. The destruction of their armory marked a turning point in the engagement. Morrison's men were now defending a facility with small arms against an enemy who had demonstrated the ability to strike anywhere at will. Their tactical advantages had been systematically eliminated by an opponent who understood their capabilities better than they understood his. Morrison himself proved to be a more formidable adversary than his subordinates. Unlike the other men in the facility who were reacting to Marcus's initiative, Morrison began to actively hunt his attacker. Using his knowledge of small unit tactics, Morrison organized his remaining men into hunting parties that could cover more ground and respond more quickly to contact. The hunter became the hunted as Morrison's teams began to close in on Marcus's position. These were not the disorganized criminals Marcus had faced on his mountain, but professional soldiers led by an officer who had survived multiple combat deployments. Marcus found himself engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with an opponent worthy of his skills. The pursuing teams forced Marcus to abandon his methodical approach and adopt the fluid tactics of guerrilla warfare. He used the facility's industrial infrastructure as both cover and weapon, turning steam pipes into projectiles and electrical systems into improvised explosives. The facility began to tear itself apart under the strain of the running battle. Marcus's military training had taught him to adapt to changing tactical situations, but his years on the mountain had taught him something more valuable: patience. While Morrison's men were burning energy and ammunition in their pursuit, Marcus was conserving his resources and waiting for the right opportunity to strike a decisive blow. That opportunity came when Morrison made a tactical error born of frustration and anger. Instead of maintaining his systematic search pattern, Morrison moved ahead of his support elements in an attempt to corner Marcus personally. It was the kind of aggressive leadership that had probably served him well in conventional military operations, but it violated the basic principle of never giving your enemy a chance at a single high-value target. Marcus had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. From a concealed position in the facility's main building, he had a clear shot at Morrison as the colonel advanced without adequate cover. The shot that ended Bradley Morrison's criminal career was fired from the same rifle that had once served America in the mountains of Afghanistan, but this time it was protecting American wildlife instead of foreign policy objectives. Morrison's death broke the morale and coordination of his remaining men. Without their leader's tactical expertise and command authority, they reverted to defensive positions and began looking for ways to escape the facility that had become their tomb. Marcus allowed some of them to flee, focusing his attention on the core group that had been directly involved in planning the assault on his mountain. As dawn broke over the Montana facility, Marcus surveyed the destruction he had wrought in a single night of operations. Buildings were burning, vehicles were destroyed, and the criminal organization that had threatened his sanctuary had been effectively eliminated. The few survivors who had managed to escape would not have the resources or coordination to continue their operations. Marcus spent the morning collecting intelligence materials that would allow law enforcement to identify and arrest the organization's financial backers and political protectors. The files contained evidence of corruption that reached into state and federal agencies, revealing a network of complicity that had allowed the criminal enterprise to operate with impunity. But Marcus did not intend to rely solely on the legal system to ensure that the threat was permanently eliminated. Before leaving the facility, he planted evidence that would lead investigators to conclude that the destruction had resulted from an internal conflict over profits and territory. The surviving criminals would be too busy protecting themselves from law enforcement to reorganize their operations. The drive back to his mountain took Marcus through some of the most beautiful country in America, vast wilderness areas that were home to the wildlife the criminal organization had been systematically destroying. As he traveled, Marcus felt a peace that had eluded him since his return from military service. For the first time in years, he had used his skills in service of something he truly believed in. Arriving back at his property, Marcus found that the wildlife had already begun to return. Deer were grazing in his meadows, eagles were circling overhead, and the forest was alive with the sounds of creatures that no longer had to fear human predators. The mountain had reclaimed its peace, and Marcus had found his purpose as its guardian. In the months that followed, Marcus worked with Sarah Williams and other conservationists to establish a network of protected areas throughout the region. Using his military skills for planning and coordination rather than destruction, he helped create a sanctuary system that would preserve wilderness areas for future generations. The nightmares that had once plagued Marcus's sleep were replaced by dreams of the mountain in different seasons, of wildlife thriving under his protection, and of a future where his skills served life instead of death. He had found redemption in the most unlikely place, a remote mountain that had asked nothing of him except that he learn to live in peace. Marcus Kane, the former sniper who had taken too many lives in service of his country, had become Marcus Kane the Guardian, protector of a mountain where life flourished under his watchful care. The war was over, and both he and the mountain had won.